Hello, sisters. Oh my god, I don't even have my mic plugged in. Jesus Christ. So, Izzy commented and she was like, why is this at the same time as the other one? This was supposed to be 9 a.m. and the other one was supposed to be 9 p.m. But I was obviously tired and did it wrong. Can you hear me? Please tell me you can hear me. You can hear me, right? You can hear me. Okay, good. Okay, great. Right, let's get go. All right. Okay, part 4. Vivas to those who have failed. And there's a quote by Oscar Wilde. It is unpractical and it goes against human nature. This is why it is worth carrying out, and that is why one proposes it. For what is a practical scheme? A practical scheme is either a scheme that is already in existence or a scheme that could be carried out under existing conditions. But it is exactly the existing conditions that one objects to, and any scheme that would accept these conditions is wrong and foolish. Oscar Wilde, The Soul of a Man Under Socialism. Okay, chapter 30. Veronique was right. The apartment was tiny, the kitchen no bigger than a bathroom stall, the toilet instructive, teaching me my first new word, fuite, leak, also escape. We walked from dawn until dusk, as if we were still in flight, returning only for Anna's quick translations and to sleep. The city smelled of sun and ripe fruit. It didn't rain for weeks. When we got hungry, we'd pop into a bakery and grab a croissant or baguette stuffed with saucisson or cheese. When we were tired, we'd sit in some crumbling church and listen to organists practicing on ancient tubes, or slump into cold green metal chairs at Luxembourg Gardens. The manicured trees didn't bother me anymore. I liked their knobby fists, the children pushing boats across the tiny lake with poles. I'd stop in front of Le Triomphe de Silence, de Silène, watch Dionysus' drunk tutors try to get on the mule. We'd visit the beehives, greet the creatures, aim towards light, and then walk to the little orchard of apples and pears. Even persimmons unfurled their bright green leaves. In the afternoon, we'd stop for a beer or a glass of wine and sit at a cafe watching the French go by. They seemed so serene, done with their guillotining and massacres and prayer breakfasts. All they had left was a few client states and the dirty linen of old men. We saw women riding bikes in high heels, pedestrians with their closed, impassive but interested faces. Up at the bar, where it was the cheapest, men with red noses stood arguing wildly over soccer or politics or reading the paper and sending up putrid smoke. We took refuge outside, even in winter, so we could breathe. Sometimes, in the subway, we'd see a black kid, like the ones in Havana, uncomfortable in his new baggy jeans and bling. The white people in the platform would move away, not understanding he was just trying it on, like a young poet from Kentucky might sometimes sound like John Donne, sometimes Allen Ginsberg. Veronique's mom got this girl, Badette, to take us around at night in her enormous British checkered cab. Drunk from a picnic basket with wine and snacks, I stared at all the blazing palaces and cathedrals and hotels of the City of Light that were too beautiful to bear, and I started to bellow the one phrase I'd learned in case I was attacked as a Yank. Je suis la bête américaine, I'm the American beast, which Babette thought was hilarious and got me to say over and over. Despite myself, little thready roots probed the soil. There were still skyscrapers everybody hated for its ugly box-like shape, rising out of nowhere. The Tower of Montparnasse. I imprinted it on like a little bird. If I looked through our bedroom window at night, I could catch a glimpse of its lights. I imagined its twins. Sundays were slow and empty when almost everything shut down. We'd get croissants, maybe in the afternoon we'd turn on some music, some Al Green. We'd slow dance together, like we were nearly human. Like we loved each other and had permission for just a minute to let the world go to hell while we kissed. We got library cards, and I took out mysteries and books on cheese and wine, learning a vocabulary of bullets, casings, autopsies, fog, vintages, material, var- varietals, mold, and molds. I listened to the radio, half-heartedly picking out words. I didn't really want to understand French and mess up my pure music of the human voice. Still, it happened. The people at the épicerie recognized me, then the woman at the vegetable stand, and a neighbor who knew who I was but ignored me. Eventually, I registered with the prefecture, got x-rays made of my lungs, was duly interviewed, hoarse from screaming at a soccer game, produced proof of borrowed financial resources, swore up and down that I wouldn't look for a job, and was awarded a visa. Anna called her friend Harriet Hirschhorn, who had hooked us up with the French girl, Marie de Senival, and moved there before us. They were living near the Gare de l'Est, along with Marie's teenage kid Leah. I'd met Harriet once or twice at the Avengers and Dyke TV. She was this short, thin video maker with long blonde curly hair. We celebrated the 4th of July together at Luxembourg, where they gave free showings of Broken Blossoms, the silent film with Lillian Gish and Richard Barthelmess as Chang Huan, who saves her from her abusive alcoholic father and redeems the Asian race. I offered a profession. Sorry. I offered a profession of my fading American faith in the form of potato salad and hot dogs, which we gobbled as we waited. Surely the truth would become self-evident again. On the 4th of July, we celebrated French's National Day with liberty, equality, and fraternity and bloody rage. To arms, citizens, let's march. We went to see the fireworks that night. Waiting, I had the impulse to reach out and participate. The mosquitoes are awful, I said to an older lady near us in my halting French. That's true, she agreed. Mama! She's like sitting right in front of the door staring at me. She does this thing where she like leaves and then she just looks at me. Like she comes from far away and just sits there staring at me. I don't know what to do with that moment. Why don't you come here? Okay. A week or two later, we all ate dinner at Chris and Jiang's. I'd forgotten they had lent us their old apartment 10, 12 years before on our first trip to Paris. Since then, they'd moved to a place near the Bastille with the Scientology headquarters across the street. We stared at it for a while, but didn't see anything secret. Their hall was full of golf clubs and tennis rackets. We mostly spoke English, but they encouraged me to try my French. I'd blurt something out, then feel like an asshole for making those strange sounds. Jiang, a Vietnamese-American brainiac, tortured me about my pronunciation of the vowels in moules, muscles. Moule? I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it. But I teased her back about her haircut, and just like that we became friends. I started to work again, revising a book on Cuba, writing for the Gully, looking for grants. Words began to return to Anna, too, after we clocked enough miles circling the city. I pretended not to notice that she disappeared sometimes with a notebook. The days shortened. It started to rain. We had drafty windows. One morning in late October, the radio announced quote-unquote disturbances in a couple of the banlieue outlying neighborhoods where poor immigrants and their French descendants were shunted off. Two black teenagers running from ID-checking cops climbed a fence into an electric substation and got electrocuted. Afterwards, there were huge, large demos protesting racism and profiling and unemployment before the whole thing degenerated, and across the country young men of color started in on the French national sport of burning cars and breaking the shop windows of their own neighbors as a kind of autoimmune disease. It escalated for days until a group of youths in the Paris suburb of Sevan attacked a bus loaded with passengers. A disabled woman couldn't get out, and one of the kids doused her with gas and threw in a Molotov cocktail. She survived, but with horrible burns. Nothing happened in our fancy corner of Paris. If we hadn't read the news online or listened to the radio, we wouldn't have noticed the difference. There was just a little shattered glass around one or two bus stops. Anna wanted to go out to the Clichy-sous-Bois and report on the riots for the gully, but I threw a small fit remembering the dust-covered sight of her after she ran from the falling World Trade Center. Later on, though, we went to a community meeting out in one of the banlieues to hear a speaker who had something to do with Muslims and women. They had a dinner first, and we ate with a whole Vietnamese meal with soup, then rice, noodles, po bun, and wine, of course. They collected €10 each, and we talked to a skinny imam who declared he was a feminist and lectured us at length. Quote, "A secular state is so important," end quote, he said. Quote, "especially for women. France already has a problem with misogyny. The last thing we need is conservative Muslims getting free rein. You heard about the woman in the suburb? Splashed acid on her for uncovering her face? Just terrible. Did you go to the march put on by Ni Put Ni Soumise? End quote. Neither whores nor doormats. He was almost the only man there among the women of North African and East African descent. They were barely considered citizens by French people who seemed unmistakably Gaulish to me. The way they organized things and argued and instructed. French people, like Cubans, are always explaining. That I even noticed was a sign I was becoming something more than a tourist, no matter how much I wanted to stay superfluous, let others agitate. I liked being foreign, an undifferentiated American. Like James Baldwin or Gertrude Stein, I needed distance. I should have been warned when I began the gully how painful it was to write as an American and embattled queer. Every word you write about hate and violence will trace its own wound. It's, I'd still double over with cramps in the street, practically crawl to the seat on a metro. Anna had to haul me back home and up the narrow stairs, past the glaring concierge and a puzzled, mossy statue of Neptune, god of the sea. Once I woke up and couldn't open my eyes. There was this incredible gunk shooting out my pink eyes. A doctor made a house call, diagnosed conjunctivitis, and gave me a prescription for a bunch of orange drops. He only charged about $60. I staggered out with my hands out like you do in the dark. Or I staggered around with my hands out like you do in the dark. They were just across the street from a Scientology place. I think she's just like remarking on the environment, like oh, like she saw that. Yeah. Um, I should have gone back to grad school. I thought, gotten a job like Amy, who'd made a tidy sum with her stock options before the tech bubble burst. Sometimes I blamed Anna. I'd never have started the gully if not for her continual rants about Eliane. It was futile anyway. We published the same stories over and over. Black men dead at the hands of cops, dead queers, dead civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, with their arms and legs blown off. Should I name the dead? Daniel Pearl, Pim Fortier, Sakia Gunn, all killed because of who they were. Then there was Al, gone, too. In New York, queers mobilized crowds against a white comedian doing blackface while ignoring a visit from Robert Mugabe, who incited violence against us, actually killed real black queers, slaughtered his opponents for of all orientations. No gully in the rock. And for that I was broken in a world where, as Virginia Woolf wrote, only money dignifies work. All I wanted to do was walk and sit and swallow the beautiful sky. Even when Anna started spending her days at the library, we'd still stroll after dinner in the growing dark. Every shop window was carefully composed as the Luxembourg Gardens. At the Seine, lights flickered across the black water, and the clouds were monstrously grey and white in the purple sky. You could imagine gods up there. They were doing Wagner that year at the Paris Opera, the whole ring cycle with Robert Wilson directing. Anna splurged on tickets, and we saw every act of every opera from the forging of the ring to the twilight of the gods, which seemed apropos of everything. I'd love to see the whole ring cycle. My first violin teacher, I remember when I was like a little kid, like her coming and telling me like, yeah, I'm playing in the opera and we're playing the whole ring cycle. This is how many hours it is. And I was like, there isn't Scientology in France anymore. I think they got rid of them around the mid 2000s. France is one of those countries, like China, I think, that is really happy to be like, you know what? All of these crazy things. Like, I'm pretty sure you can't be a JW, Jehovah's Witness, in France either. I think there's like a couple different things that France has declared to be like. I think France and Germany are the two countries that have like banned Scientology 100%. But I'm sure there's like Scientologists who are like, like guerrilla, like undercover, whatever bullshit. Okay, let's go. Then in February, now 2006, well, look at that. She told us what year it is. For the first time in the book, on page 206. Ilan Halimi died. He was a young Jewish man who had worked in a cell phone store. His kidnappers, the gang of barbarians, were mostly young African immigrants or their descendants who figured one of them can come up with some dough. For 24 days, they hurt him every way they could think of. Then they set him on fire and dumped his ravaged body by some railroad tracks. He wasn't quite dead yet, but almost. The cops tried to cover things up, and it looked like for a while journalists and it took a while for journalists to break the story of the anti-Jewish rants the barbarians made during ransom calls, the Muslim prayers they recited, and the videos they made showing Ilan blindfolded with a gun to his head like the ones the Iraqi kidnappers put out. The neighbors knew the whole time and did nothing. Some got in on the act. We went to an SOS Racisme march on February 26th. There were a lot of people, as many as 50,000. Most of the marchers seemed to be Jews, as if the rest of the city didn't care, despite all the plaques in front of the elementary schools about deported children. On the Rue du Temple, I used to pass a panel to Raoul Nadet, resistant member, resistance member, next to a window full of handbags. He lived in the building before he got arrested and exterminated in Matheson in 1942. It was a peculiar experience, being on a march like that in Paris. Probably some of the other people on the right and left had parents or aunts or uncles or grandparents who had been rounded up by the Vichy government and ratted out by their French Christian neighbors and sent to the camps. Anna wore a tag with a big pink triangle that said, in French, enough hate. I had a sudden sense that the joint frailty of our human bodies, how easy it would be with a few guns to herd us all into cattle cars and kill us. That is, if you first reimagined us as animals. And if we continue to behave as animals, constrained by politeness and respect and our own optimism. We know we are humans like you, after all, not beasts. You couldn't possibly. Some teenage boys started running through the crowd, shouting and shoving and waving Israeli flags and Jewish Defense League banners. They had handkerchiefs drawn up over their faces like gorillas. At first, they just seemed like high-spirited, they just seemed high-spirited, asserting some power after years of being harassed. Then we heard the sound of breaking of store windows. Some of the older protesters were shaken. Later, a Muslim shopkeeper was roughed up by a couple of passerbys. It's so easy to become the thing that you hate. Choose the opposite role for the moment that history repeats. Okay, but I have to say, it's not like you were beating up people or you. Like, clearly, when they went to this thing, they weren't expecting it to be this way because she seems kind of like, oh shit, this is going down. So I don't really think it's like your fault just because you were fucking standing there. Okay. It's a different thing if you knew it was going to happen and you were like, yes, this should happen. I'm going to be there while it happens. I don't think that's the case. Okay. Clown World says women are so quick to take the blame for everything. Yes. And it's very clear, especially with race specifically, that Kelly is very, you know. Okay. When spring rolled around, I decided to retire the gully, clear my head, try to make some money for a change. I broke the news to Anna, then Amy, who was attending a music college in Sweden. We resigned the thing and put it to bed on April 3rd, 2006, after more than 6 years. I shredded the book I'd been trying to write on Cuba and the ridiculous mystery. I turned 40. For my birthday, Veronique's mom arranged a boat trip around Paris at dusk. Lights shimmering on the water, the gold of my favorite fantastical bridge glowed. We shivered and admired, then drank hot chocolate. A couple of weeks later, we headed back to New York, at least for a while. Chapter 31. When I returned to Paris almost a year later, it was more of a homecoming than flight, a relief to be foreign in a place I actually was. In the East Village, the scrawny, weedy lots down the block had been pimped out to look like suburban office buildings, but were actually luxury apartments for the horribly rich. Access to the river was blocked. Pissed off people didn't take to the streets. They went online and shrieked at anti-Bush sites, which had no discernible impact on his illegal wars, the torture, the domestic spying, the disastrous handling of Katrina. In the fall, Democrats had finally taken a stand with the midterm message, "Vote for us, we're not Republicans." Oh my God. They would have lost again except for the GOP's Mark Foley got caught drooling over boy pages. He and his Republican homo scandal turned the tide. Not the economy, or Iraq, or Halliburton, or the Constitution lying at the bottom of the American birdcage. I didn't know why queers were thrilled. Anti-gay marriage amendments passed in 7 out of the 8 states at issue, making it 27 states where gay marriage was expressly banned. I belonged back in France, yearned for it when they threw another riot in the banlieue, smashing everything in their paths. So much blab from the elite, and the rest left with either silence or paving stones. Why not try to push your way into their monologues, change an abstract discourse about jobs and racism and immigration into something a little more real? Maybe with your face on it. Read my lips. Accept, accept, accept. The guys setting stuff on fire were almost always thugs, jumping onto buses with weapons, scaring the crap out of innocent people, their neighbors mostly, just so they could drive the thing a few yards away and set it on fire. It reeked of macho satisfaction. Look what I did. My fire's bigger than yours. Which I guess is why Bush showed around the picture of Saddam, his face all bloated and dead after the execution. I got a gig to cover a huge agricultural fair in Paris and went back alone in the spring. The paper was the Louisville Courier-Journal. I thought it was hilarious my byline would read, "Columnist for Gay City News in New York. Yes, Mrs. Cogswell's daughter is a big fucking dyke." Anna was supposed to follow almost immediately. When she got delayed, our swap fell through, and I spent the next couple of months in déjà vu mode, changing neighborhoods as often as I did, fresh off the bus from New York City. First, Harriet and Marie put me up in their new place in the back of Père-Lachaise Cemetery. We visited Oscar Wilde's kiss-covered monument and the bullet hole in the wall where the last rebels of the Paris Commune were lined up and shot. Then I watered plants for 3 or 4 weeks at Mathilde's while she went off in a ship to dig up oceanic rocks. She was Marie's cousin, a dyke too. She lived in a high-rise in Belleville with these big drafty windows showing enormous apartment buildings stuffed with immigrants, remnants of the old city, and some pointy church. Clouds could get stuck in their spires and break free in range of double and triple windows. A block away was an enormous market filled with women from Morocco and Algeria and Senegal. The nearby Rue de Belleville changed from West African to Chinese and South Asian, with pockets of white working-class French in between. To get anywhere, I had to run the gauntlet of old Arab men. They stared at me, sometimes with indifference, sometimes with hate. Maybe they hated everybody. They wanted to go home, but they were stuck in Paris. Maybe they just hated me. I wasn't crazy about them either. Some of their sons were brutal assholes, knocking blonde Harriet off her rollerblades. N'importe quoi. She was an affront, a high-flying woman. I went to this one Moroccan bakery where the men were unusually nice to me, but then I figured out that they figured I was a guy. They seemed pissed off when they realized the mistake. I went back anyway when I had the nerve because they had these great cheap fried buns full of tuna and olives and boiled eggs. Also, I thought it did them good to see me with my polite dyke bonjour and parting bonne journée on the way to the Salon de l'Agriculture. God, I liked my fairs, especially ones with wine. Not long after my grandmother died, I dragged Anna and her brother Pablo to a fair in upstate New York and made them look at chickens and eat corns and go to a demolition derby. The crowd rose to their feet and covered their hearts as a canned soprano wailed the Star Spangled Banner, and the waiting cars below shot flames from things that looked like organ pipes. Then Pablo and I rode something that bucked and curved and screwed so thoroughly with my equilibrium that I still nauseated the next day. That's Murica. Chirac opened the fair as current president, nostalgic that this was his last time to kiss old Bessie between her well groomed bovine eyes before somebody else took over. I pressed through the scrum of journalists and bodyguards, who all pretended that I was perfectly normal to see a power suited politico surrounded by hay and manure, and the ruddy white faced farmers who spent all their days outdoors. This was the message that at heart France was still some rural idyll where even the most sophisticated Parisian is only a step away from a farm where milkmaids frolic and grandpa distilled his own fruit spirits. No matter that 90% of the French shops and supermarkets and the kids in the banlieues speak only the language of burning cars. All the presidential candidates came afterwards. Nicolas Sarkozy was a law and order guy like Giuliani, and about as bad tempered. When he got heckled from the crowd about his handling of the 2005 riots, he shot back, quote, "Shut up, you stupid asshole," end quote. It made headlines for days. Ségolène Royal was there too, after squeaking through the primaries to be the socialist candidate, and I stood in line with the other journalists for a chance to video her chewing steak with the beef lobby. I got pulled into her campaign when Mathilde came back and I stayed with Harriet and Marie again. It had taken them a while to get on board, even if Sego was gay friendly. Maybe because the whole stiletto heel thing didn't go over much with Dykes, or because she spoke out against crime, which always horrified the bougie left and got painted as a provincial mother of four sure to drag the party to the right. Sego did grow up in the right-wing Catholic family with a father who kept his sons in military buzz cuts, but I grew up Southern Baptist in Kentucky, so what does that prove? I liked her message that France was for everybody. The misogynist hacks in her own socialist party were even more skeptical than the Dykes. Former Prime Minister Lionel Jospin was such a dick that when he withdrew from the primaries, he declared he'd support anybody but "quote unquote la candidate," the female candidate. Sego's only chance was to reach out to the ordinary people, taking a page from Hillary Clinton's senatorial campaign with "quote unquote" listening tours and town hall style meetings. Quote, "I become convinced that citizens are the only real legitimate experts on any of the questions facing us," end quote. That's when I fell in love with the actual word citizen. In the United States, we don't use it much unless we're talking about immigration. National politics usually National politicians usually stick to quote unquote my fellow Americans, implying a kind of geographical craps game you just happen to be a part of. In France, politicians all said quote unquote my fellow citizens, draping us with obligations and making me feel like part of this enormous human project whose goal, still is to construct a state aimed towards liberty, equality, fraternity. It worked for Sego anyway. She packed whole stadiums. People from the banlieues cheered next to formerly cynical French dykes. Even the jocks got involved, like Chris and Jiang, and their friend Valerie, a book restorer that I'd started to hang out with sometimes. I met her at a workshop full of old paper with glue pots and weights when we'd picked up sandwiches. Then we picked up sandwiches and played boule at the Roman arena nearby. I joined them when they were flying at the Gare de Lyon. I felt like a citizen myself, at least of Paris. I'd earned my papers walking the streets, arguing in cafes, marching for Ilan Halimi. Hell, I patted cows at the fair, knew where dozens of public libraries were and all the Monoprix supermarkets. I even asked Veronique's mom to ask Saint Genevieve, who watches over the city, to bring Anna back safe and sound. This was my fight too, even if I hoped nobody would hear my accent and accuse me of interfering where I didn't belong. Luckily, people just took the damn pamphlets and didn't bother me, though Chris got harangued a couple of times by a certain kind of white man who would get all red faced when he saw Sego's face on the brochure. Or maybe it was Marie who got called quote unquote dirty cunt, quote unquote filthy whore. It was around then that I woke up one night to the howling from another room. Harriet was out of town, and Marie had been out with a fag friend. They went to a gay bar where they just had time to order a drink before this big brutal bouncer said Marie had to go, and when she asked why, just grabbed her and tossed her out. They didn't want any females in there. His fat fingers left incredible bruises. Distracted, she had an accident on her rollerblades and broke her wrist, hence the howling. She had to have surgery and a couple pins. I harassed the nurses in my bad French. Be careful. She has trouble with anesthesia. Almost died once. Understand? After that, Marie worked harder than ever for Ségolène. Like, to me, I don't know. So this section of the book, we are 13 pages through this section 4. I find it a little disjointed from the rest of the book. It's like when this thing where she's like, I tried to speak French in a way that wouldn't get them to think I was like a foreigner or like one of the bad ones or whatever. It's like, so you're trying to assimilate, but then talks about how getting the other people to assimilate is basically racism, but then for her it's good. I don't get it. It's kind of stupid. And then also it seems like this section of the book she's talking about like race and like immigration and stuff, but really what it sounds like, it's very very obvious every time she mentions somebody beating up someone else getting beat up, somebody being fucked over, it's all men, it's all men. Like, to me this is more of like a patriarchal power struggle bullshit of their men measuring their dicks to each other that has nothing to do with anybody else. Actually, it's all about this, phallocratic bullshit. And I'm actually pretty disappointed that she hasn't had any analysis of that. Like, does she think that because the men that she's talking about are immigrants or Muslim or something, she can't be like, oh yeah, it was fucked up? Like, she never actually says it was bad for them to be doing this. She's just kind of like, the thing they shared was the violence. I don't know. Okay. On election night, we all went to a party at Chris and Zhang's. We were hopeful at first, drinking wine, making jokes. Then the depressing results poured in. Tears rolled down Zhang's face as Sego gave her concession speech on a balcony outside her headquarters, promising she wouldn't disappear. Was in it for the long haul, and she did hold more public meetings, trying to find a new direction, but she was trapped by the socialist ball and chain. All that misogyny. There we go. Like, she mentions misogyny once at the beginning of the chapter and once at the end of the chapter, and the whole fucking chapter is about misogyny. It's a pretty weak sauce, to be honest. Heading to the train to go home after the party, I got caught in a demo at the Bastille, yanked my camera out of its case, and started to film. The cops were heaving tear gas at protesters, lanky white boys, mostly a few girls. The thin column with the gold figure on top disappeared in smoke, along with the cops moving around behind it. The gas wasn't so close at first, just a faint burning of lungs and eyes. I pulled my shirt over my mouth. Then one canister hit almost at my feet, and I was blinded, stumbling around like I had conjunctivitis again and could only open my eyes for a fraction of a second at a time. I'd get a glimpse of things, then dash away with my eyes shut. Life's like that, I thought. Chapter 32. My eyes were still tearing when I got back to our two-room duplex on Rue Cadet. What happened to you? Anna had just arrived a day or two before, underwhelmed at our new dump that had wires dangling in the hallways. I'd only grabbed it because the decent, cheap places had lines around the block of clean-cut white kids with doziers proving they had good job contracts or that their parents were stinking rich. Landlords didn't want foreigners, even white ones, without fat assets in France. A couple days later, when an enormous storm left a bunch of puddles all over our stuff upstairs, our friend Valérie lent us temporary place in the Fifth Arrondissement. School kids shrieked in the schoolyard behind and kicked at a soccer ball against our wall. We'd sit drinking at the cheapest neighborhood place, L'Invitable. The Institut du Monde Arabe was nearby, and we'd see young Muslim women in headscarves and expensive shoes sailing down the street with their fists clenched. I figured some were true believers, others just used their headscarves to flip the bird at French society. Many had voted for Sego, dragging their mothers and grandmothers to the rallies, willing to be citizens of a France that included them, not just demanding obligations, but sharing rights. Those young Muslim women were a world away from the figures covered head to toe in black who would pass by sometimes when we finally found a place in the 19th. These were fat and ravaged and mute. Teeth were missing. They looked a million years old but were probably my age. They'd been working like mules, used as breeders. Okay, she's trying to make a distinction. So, is she saying that if you are in a situation where you are forced to wear the burqa or the niqab and you are, like she's here, so what does she say? These were fat and ravaged and mute. Teeth were missing. They looked a million years old, but were probably my age. They'd been worked like mules, used as breeders. They hadn't chosen anything. And their daughters behind them, already in scarves, looked warily at their brothers half their age, but already with sharp little fists. Does she really think that the difference between a niqab and a hijab is enough? That none of this applies? That, oh, well, you're wearing a hijab, so it must have been your choice? Or you have expensive shoes, so you have money, so it must have been your choice? Just like a really, really weak analysis. Like, really weak. Okay. Like, oh, you have money, but you're a woman in a Muslim culture. So, like, I don't know in the 2000s who these Muslim women are that she's talking about. But to me, this is like, I watched this kind of like docudrama last night about farming in Malawi, and at one like because they're starving, and at one point there's like this girl who's like 14, who's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go and like be with teacher. It's very clear what she means because she's like starving, and that way she'll have some food. And I'm like, when you see these rich Muslim women, I'm like, whose money is that? What did they do to get that money? It's not like, oh, they have power. Like, okay, whatever. Let's keep going. I tried not to see them, had my own problems. I'd get harassed by the guards at the monopliques at Place des Fêtes. They'd take one look at my German army fatigues and spiky dyke hair and stop me at the door. Quote, we have to check your backpack, end quote. And my French was good enough to scream at them. Quote, why pick on me when you just let the other woman go by? She had a backpack too, only hers was leather, and she was dressed nicer. Is that it? Is that what that handbag there? Sorry. And what about that handbag there that just slipped by you as you hassle me? Hers is 3 times bigger than my tiny sack. Why didn't you stop her? End quote. Sometimes people would pause in my defense, though that had its own pitfalls because sometimes they'd start to imply the guards were wrong because they were black, not because they were assholes. I got tired of the show and walked an extra couple of blocks to the grubby little monoplique at the other direction. In the other direction where nobody cared if I had 1 backpack or 10. Often the 19th seemed like Cuba, a neighborhood of men, and I had no business there. There were a lot of West African guys who lived in single rooms. I'd see them in the laundromat, doing their own wash for the first time ever, struggling with the machines. There were transgendered women too. Oh my fucking god, guys. It's been like 10 chapters since she mentions trans women. So, of course, here we need to bring it up. There were transgendered women too, speaking Latin American Spanish. North African guys, both Muslims and Jews, would walk back and forth on the sidewalk trying to get glimpses of them. Sometimes we'd hear about bloody fights between rival gangs. All that testosterone put to bad use after their ascending star, Sarkozy, got his own rocks off getting quotas for deporting undocumented immigrants, 25,000 by the end of the year, and they were behind schedule. By then, I wasn't a visitor anymore, no matter what my visa said. I got interested in immigrant issues, like the danger of open windows. There was that Russian kid who cracked his head open, falling from one while trying to elude police. The North African man slipping from a window ledge and fracturing his leg. A Chinese woman ended up in a coma after plunging from a window. She got spooked, thinking they were coming for her when the cops started knocking on the door of a neighboring apartment. At least Parisians were a little like us East Village types, who used to scream at cops when their badge number and take their badge numbers when they were rousting young men in the neighborhood. And in Paris, passerby would gather spontaneously to stop cops as they moved in for raids. Passengers on planes would throw fits when deportees were on them, and sometimes ground flights for hours. Anna and I went to a couple of marches. I'd take my video camera, and once a woman gave me a teary, quote, "Thanks for coming, no one is paying attention," end quote, look. Looking around, I thought about a doctor who told me his usual gig was working with poor immigrants. Quote, "You never know what you're going to see when they undress. One old bullet wounds, scars from machetes, other scars you can't see. You should write about that." End quote. Harriet and Marie went too. Marie was an AIDS activist with SIDAction and did a lot of work in Africa. She saw the effect of Sarko's policies, but she and Harriet were just as angry as the socialists. All the misogyny the election had uncovered, it poisoned everything. Marie finally circulated an email asking if any other women out there were just as pissed off and got enough responses to form La Barbe, which means the beard, but also enough. Marie had been in ACT UP Paris, Harriet in the Avengers and Dyke TV, and a million feminist groups. There were also fans of billionaires for Bush who had punked the Republicans. La Barbe was based on an equally simple idea: invading men's spaces like the board meetings, slapping on beards, then quote unquote congratulating the assholes for keeping out girls. Oh, hey, Stefan. Okay, so she mentions, like, oh, this woman who's been like in a million feminist groups. These women, clearly some of them were radical feminist, right? Like when she talks about Marie and Harriet, every time they're talking about misogyny, okay? And now they're creating like a direct action group specifically. You love La Balbe. I never heard of them before. They just created La Balbe. This woman, Kelly. She's one of the founders. Yeah, same thing, Izzy. I don't think it's going to mention it. I feel like we're rounding up. Like, we're about to end the book. There's 15 pages left and we're in Paris. So, Izzy said, I heard a bunch of the Lesbian Avengers actively supported Camp Trans. Okay, but this is the thing. What year was that conflict in Camp Trans? Because officially, the Lesbian Avengers disbanded in 1997. So, I'm not saying that there were not women who were Lesbian Avengers who did that. I don't think it's like the group decided to do that. I think there was like women who used to be Lesbian Avengers who still had the shirts, who still were friends with each other, who went and did that. You know what I'm saying? And like throughout this book, whenever the Lesbian Avengers does anything, most of the time it's like very controversial and there's like, disagreements within the group. So I'm not saying they didn't do that. I'm just saying I don't know if it's like fair to say like all the Lesbian Avengers were down with that shit. Anyway, okay. I guess it's not in this book. We're gonna find something that talks about it at some point, like an article or maybe interview someone who was there. That would be cool. Okay. Before the first action of the Lagbal, okay, Harriet and Marie came over and squeezed themselves around our tiny table to eat. Quote, "You guys should participate," end quote. I felt guilty but declined. I had all the confrontation I could handle every time I left the house, and my papers weren't quite in order. I was suddenly the cautious immigrant. I also wanted to think about other means of resistance that cost me less. Writing, thinking, maybe art. Okay, but didn't she just say, like 3 pages ago, that all of the leftist Americans who were sick of Bush, they were just whining about it online and that had no effect? But somehow, if she wants to write about things online, that's like her resistance. Um, my brain is a laboratory. Anna might have been interested in a group if it were for dykes, but it wasn't. She also want she also didn't want to be the one immigrant, the one person of color. Besides, she'd already done her bit for France the first time she'd lived there, working in the women's and gay groups. Les Gouin Rouge, the Red Dykes. I don't know how you say that. Green Rouge? She also didn't want to lose focus on her book. She finally let me take a look, 6 or 7 drafts on. It was as strange and angry. It was as strange and angry as The Invisible Man, and hilarious in a bitter, Rabelaisian sort of way. It seemed timely, still does, how it grapples with identity. The 2008 presidential election was underway in the United States, and Hillary Clinton was the first female candidate for the Democratic spot. Got treated about as well as Ségolène in France. South Park writers weapons hid nuclear weapons in Clinton's cartoon vagina, and men howled their disgust at Clinton's shrieky, harpy, schoolmarmy voice, those fat, childbearing, repulsive hips. But then I noticed plenty of dykes in the chorus, even if they had hips too, and were furious and shrill and aging fast. Not that she was perfectly clean. Every now and then, one of Clinton's people would float a trial balloon mentioning offensively how well spoken Obama was or something. But then even Obama's guys indulged a little in immigrant bashing, briefly trying to demonize Clinton's South Asian contributors as the economic boogeyman, dumping American workers for Indian techies. And when Sarah Palin got picked as John McCain's VP, now the National Organization of Women, like, I don't know anything about it. So I'm going to find an article or someone to interview or something. But like to me, it definitely wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that you know, there was like, because also what she talks about towards the end of the Lesbian Avengers before they get disbanded was she was like, it was supposed to be like an open group, like anybody could join, right? But so she was like, all these women would just show up, like college students who had no activist background, who had no like class analysis or whatever. Um, and to me, it sounded like at the end of the Lesbian Avengers, there was more of those women than of like the leaders or like the women who had experience and vision and whatever. So it wouldn't at all be surprising to me if there was like a bunch of women at the end who were kind of basically TRAs, because like it's not like they had like a test to see your political values and are you allowed to be there, you know? Okay. So okay. And when Sarah Palin got picked as John McCain's VP, National Organization of Women actually issued a press release to say if you didn't support women candidates just because press release to say that they didn't support women candidates just because they were women. Because apparently the national organization for only those women who agree with all our policies. And queers went after queers. Democratic activists yanking Republican fags out of the closet, inciting homophobia that they hoped would blow back against the anti-gay McCain. At the same time, their candidate-in-chief, Barack Obama, was campaigning with some of those same gay-hating preachers who supported Bush and promised to dump way more money than the Texan oil man into faith-based programs. Obama would also flip-flop on primary promises and voted for bills broadening the powers of Homeland Security, which I hated, even if no one else did. I got pissed, then even more depressed. Went through a bad patch. My last ties to the United States were frayed and fragile, as my new roots in France. My whole way of life. Okay, but are you in New Roots in France? Haven't you been in France for 7 years at this point? Or no, 2003. Okay, you've been in France for 5 years. I don't know. Whatever. My whole way of life was a waste, should be ended somehow, killed, reborn maybe, rewritten at least. I'm not a, I'm not enough to resist what is. I thought about Rimbaud, who wrote all the luminous poetry and got shot and drank and fucked and made scandals, then fell ostensibly silent. Camus also went mum at the end. Sorry, on the issue, when he got tired of arguing that the French shouldn't shoot all the Arab Algerians or keep them in thrall, and that the Arabs shouldn't force all the French Algerians to flee to a country that they've probably never seen. He advocated for the third way, but nobody listened. Finally, he put down his pen. And that was a message too. I wanted to do the same, fall silent. Women attacking women, queers attacking queers, people of color attacking immigrants. But to do that, I don't know. Honestly, I'm kind of like she really is oversimplifying things here. I don't know. I guess she's trying to explain how she feels more than anything else. So maybe I should take it with a grain of salt. But like people of color attacking immigrants. She literally was like, these African dudes set people on fire in the street. If I don't think your skin color should be like, oh yeah, I must be okay with that. Or like queers attacking queers. Like she literally is talking about misogyny for this whole section. I think that lesbians like attacking other queers, aka men, is not necessarily like she's making it like, oh, this is a bad thing. Let's all like stop fighting and be friends. And it's like maybe there's good reasons that people disagree with each other, and that's okay. And also, didn't she like she literally at the top of this page, she was like, you don't have to stand for people who all agree with you, like the national organization of only those women who agree with our policies. And then down here, she's like, why can't everyone just agree? It's really bizarre. Okay. Okay. But to do that and have it mean anything, you have to already have a booming voice. People have to know you exist. And what was I? A girl getting thrown out of the Bonaparte, who never made a dent in anything. I didn't really belong anywhere, but in the street, deserted football fields, creeks. I wondered if it were a mistake to kill the gully. The whole world I'd made, where identity was complex, interwoven with everything, and resistance could mean just opening your mouth. It was the only place in my life that made sense. Sorry. Though we got it wrong sometimes, like when we sneered at Bush's quote unquote cabinet of color. Even if Powell or Rice were window dressing, the windows they looked out at what windows they looked out of, preparing the way for Obama. Sarko had done the same thing, packing his administration with brainy, beautiful, big-mouthed women of color, like Rashida Dati, Ramayade. He even dipped into the left, recruiting Fadela Amara, a feminist activist from the projects. But it was too late. I'd put the gully to bed, shredded my books, allied myself with Gerardo in Cuba, with his ellipses and shrugs. I'd walked obsessively. At night, I'd crawl into bed beside Anna and feel the curve of her back under my hand and the heat coming off of it, but the sensation would stop at about my wrist, before it would have gone all the way past my elbow and shoulder, clear to the pumping muscle of my heart. In January, we'd taken the train to the empty forest of Fontainebleau and hiked around the trails using a map we printed off the internet. When we were good and lost, we caught a glimpse of a wild boar running through the trees. But all that beauty had nothing to do with me. In the spring of '08, I was sitting on a couch and saw a bug jump on my ankle, then found one in bed. We'd gotten fleas, les puces. We fumigated the whole place, washed every scrap of clothing, but we were so disgusted we gave notice, and after a couple weeks, we fled. Chapter 33. By June, After a stint in New York, we'd installed ourselves in two unfurnished rooms in the 17th century building on Rue Visconti, a long grey street in Germain, in Saint Germain des Prés. At the Rue de Seine end, there were a couple of cheesy galleries with sculptures that were supposed to be from Banin, but arrived one by one in shopping bags carried by shady, skinny men. At the other end was a convent, and across from it, Balzac's failed printing concern that cheered me up a little. I wasn't the only writer that sucked at making money. Tourists clogged most of the cafes nearby, taking discreet pictures of Karl Lagerfeld at the Café de Flore, or posing like Sartre and de Beauvoir in Les Deux Magots, though without the cigarettes because the smoking ban had just gone into effect, which meant when Anna and I discovered a cheap cafe, we could finally sit inside. In the laundromat, up Rue de Seine, the Spanish and Americans and provincial French would mistake me for an employee and try to give me orders. I'd be nice to them anyway and use every language I knew to explain how the machines worked. Quote unquote, no, that's a washer, and I'd warn them not to leave clothes alone in the dryer because they'd magically disappear. We'd take refuge in the movie houses and bookstores. They stayed open, later than some of the cafes in case you had a sudden urge for the latest Fred Vargas mystery or a reprint of Marx's essay on the French Civil War, or a translation of Willa Cather, or a novel by Marie Ndiaye. They were all so carefully designed. I picked them up just to admire how they fit in my hand, ready to open my heart to some writer's words. I felt like we belonged, Anna and I. Dude, but why? 1 page ago, you were talking about how you didn't belong. Now, because you're in... I guess it's because she's in this neighborhood. Okay, whatever. Maybe this neighborhood reminds her of New York. Or I should have in a neighborhood that once welcomed Jeanette Flanner, Colette, and Sylvia Beach. Gertrude Stein had lived not too far away, and she actually got a plaque on her house, though it didn't mention Alice. And in our apartment, we had this air shaft patio sort of thing that had an open brick wall in back. Just behind that was a private park where Uber Sapphist Natalie Clifford Barney had her temple of friendship, throwing literary soirees and outrageous parties. A couple of trees were visible over the top of the wall. I remembered a peeling sycamore with fat gray leaves, and once or twice considered borrowing a ladder from somebody and peeking over. Instead, I'd stare at the bricks and imagine what it was like. Colette running around the neighborhood half naked with bliss. What would it feel like to be so utterly unself-conscious? I wanted to snog Anna on the street corner, throw wild parties that scandalized the bourgeoisie that hadn't improved any. I think I'm going to finish this chapter. I'm going to have to go. And then I'll read the very last chapter and do like a reaction to the whole book, I guess. Later. There was that guy on a fancy motorcycle barreling down the sidewalk. When he almost ran over Anna and we chased him down, he insulted us first as women, then dykes, then foreigners. And the crowd snickered when we called him a misogynist, turned away when we called him a homophobe, and ran back into cafes to get their smelling salts when we called him a racist, xenophobic dickhead who was the shame of France. I missed lesbians. We had our friends, of course, but hardly ever saw dykes on the metro or in the street. At the time, the only two with a national profile were an anonymous couple suing the state for the right to adopt or inseminate. I got teary that night when we saw the dyke rocker Beth Ditto do a cheesy music program on TV. She'd gotten chic all of a sudden, and her curvy naked body was all over the cover of a fashion magazine. So she doesn't like it when this dyke buys into the hypersexualization of patriarchy and like hypersexualizes herself as like a triumph form to try to get power and blah blah blah. But like she can't say that. She doesn't actually have any feminist analysis here. I don't know, whatever. Okay. We created a group, Goudou Explosive Dykes, just to march in Pride. I spent 2 days sewing and painting a red and gold banner fit for a king, brought a bunch of toy trumpets at a novelty shop, and a whole dirty dozen of us from 5 different countries made a hell of a lot of honking, squealing noises, and every girl in the crowd cheered, demanding our Gudu explosive stickers and pamphlets, and joining for several blocks. Marching, the Gudu reminded me why they were explosive. One homo on the sidelines made snide comments about how well we blew our trumpet when we knew we could do and what we could do with them later on. Young straight boys kept dodging in between us as we marched, making equally cliche suggestions. A fag marshal lectured us about preparing for the moment of silence as if we were infants, while ignoring the big loud float full of men ahead of us. Meanwhile, the 2 white guys announced the participants refused to acknowledge we existed until we took a couple of menacing steps towards them, blowing our horns. Anna and I capped off Pride weekend by attending a neighborhood talk about Barney's Temple of Friendship. But instead of juicy details about the crazy liaisons and wild dyke parties, the guy giving the lecture focused on the original boring owner and dismissed Barney as some rich American dame who gave literary soirees for important straight men. He only hinted at her being a dyke with the coy quote, Rami de Gourmand called her the Amazon. I'll leave it to your imagination as to why, end quote. So at the end, when he was taking questions, the explosive Anasimo stood up and asked why he was so reluctant to pronounce the word lesbian, and why he ignored Barney's importance in her own rights as a literary pioneer and dyke icon. Then the crowd started murmuring, some in favor, some outraged she brought up the dirty lesies. Quote, what does that have to do with anything, end quote. Though if Barney had been a guy, you could bet the speaker would have mentioned he'd conquered Colette, not the mention of Liane de Pougy, the famous courtesan. Our internet wasn't working yet, so I went to one of the municipal offices to use their free Wi-Fi and file a story about this. That's when I discovered that the city of Paris, with its gay mayor, was blocking every web page with the words lesbian, gay, or goudou. You'd get this message declaring it pornographic. All my own articles were censored, my blog apparently obscene. Even the New York Times coverage of the Paris Pride March was ostensibly a threat to public morals and delicate sensibilities of children. Where were the outraged queers? I wondered. I called up the mayor's office, but they didn't call me back until I had already written a furious article. Their main point was that Mayor Bertrand Delano couldn't be homophobic. Quote, he's gay, you know. End quote. Quote unquote, so what? I said. They unblocked my site, but that was it. The anti-gay filter stayed. The fall was cold and gray. We put plastic on the windows, wore the sweaters I needed obsessively after 9/11. Anna was plotting a new book. I was trying to rediscover my essence, writing for myself, shooting a video, changing the equation of the fight. I left messages in the street on little stickers that remained for weeks. Quand la beauté défait son corsage, ce n'est pas pour nous. When beauty unbuttons her shirt, it's not for us. I was planting my own flag in the city. I exist, I said, or I will. Yeah, exactly. Bird Kilby says the author talks about the importance of the words gay and lesbian, and then uses the next sentence she calls us queers. Yeah, it's disgusting. And also so vague. Like, again, this chapter she's talking about misogyny, right? Throughout the entire book, like half the time she mentions lesbians, she calls them queers and groups them in with men. How are you supposed to point out misogyny and notice it when you're always grouping women in with men? Like, okay. No, Maple. The rift between libfems and radfems have existed long before 2014. It's definitely existed like since the. I mean, even the this book, which was published in 1980, what was it, 1984? But even this book talks about the rift between like liberal feminism and radical feminism slightly. Like it's not the topic of the book, but it's mentioned. Okay. In the spring, we went south to Toulouse. La Barbe had been invited to a lesbian conference, and Harriet and Marie suggested they ask me and Anna to do something on the Lesbian Avengers. The theme was lesbian and the weapon of laughter, and I suspect the organizers in Toulouse expected us to be light and funny, the superheroish dykes from New York. We agreed to do it, but neither of us felt like dykes in France had anything to laugh about. US queers surely didn't. The same day Obama got elected, the same-sex marriage ban got banned in California with the passage of Proposition 8. A black man could finally be president, but queers couldn't even file joint taxes. Obama hadn't evolved very far yet on the LGBT rights. In fact, he rubbed salt in the wound by inviting Rick Warren to bless his inauguration, even if the Reverend had helped to roll back AIDS programs in Africa, fueled anti-gay campaigns in Nigeria and Uganda, and unleashed bombs with machetes. Still, crowds of queers demonstrated after the Prop 8 fiasco, and the press as usual started heralding a new movement, Stonewall 2.0, which would be mobilized by emails and tweets, not phone trees. But it fizzled pretty quickly because it wasn't rooted in anything. Our national organizations had stuck to their de-gate approach, putting nice hets front and center, talking about generic rights, reinforcing the idea that we were a bunch of perverts too disgusting to show ourselves. We forgot that we didn't need their permission to knock on doors, stand on street corners, that it paid off to court the poor and the people of color. There is one word in this book, though, that I love. She uses the term dykeliness. I have never heard that term before. I fucking love it. She uses it specifically when she's referring to Anna in Cuba for the first time in 35 years. I think the first confirmed situation where there was like a lesbian specific event where there were Tims was 1971, I'm pretty sure. Okay. It was the case for the lesbian Avengers, but the Avengers were dead. Not just dead, but obliterated. After the election, I googled them, and there was almost nothing online except for an article of Sarah Pursley's in The Nation about organizing in Idaho. It should be required reading for every queer activist. The Wikipedia entry was worse than none. There was nothing anywhere about the dozens of chapters worldwide, all those actions, the tens of thousands of dykes who marched behind Lesbian Avengers banners in DC, New York, and San Francisco. A few cities had Dyke March websites, but they rarely mentioned their origins, as if they had been ashamed of them. Sometimes I was. All that ugliness at the end, in the beginning, so much hope, and for what? Getting ready for the conference, I emailed Sue Friedrich, and she sent me a DVD of Lesbian Avengers Eat Fire 2. It was only the second time I'd seen it. I felt a little nervous, just slipping it into my laptop. My god, what a paradox box. Sorry, what a Pandora's box. What a relic. We'd gone from the war on culture to the war on terror. From my work at the Gully, I knew dykes were still in the streets, but in Guatemala City or South African townships, not New York. It was ancient history, almost indecent to watch. But then I started seeing familiar faces. The Irish dyke Sheila Quinn, and the cabbie Phyllis Lutsky, the filmmaker Sue Friedrich. Anna was there in the Plaza Hotel, talking to the camera about that Colorado boycott as a security guard tried to haul her away. Dykeliness is next to godliness. Izzy says, spoiler alert, the main character in Stone Butch Blues, based on her, get intimate with a Tim at one point because they can't relate to others. It's really full on quote unquote queer propaganda, but some bits are still interesting. Yes, exactly. That's what I'm referencing. That Stefan says Dr. M wrote about it in Uncommon Ground Media. She mentioned 1971, 1971. Yeah, it was like the National Lesbian Conference in 1971 in California. Um, Actually, the first person I heard about it from was Gay Chapman. She sent me like a picture of like a a lesbian zine or a lesbian newspaper or something where one of the women was ranting like I went to this thing and this fucking douche was there and this is what happened and the women supported him. That was the first I heard of it. Then I later read Dr. M's article. Okay. Shit, I really need to leave soon. I thought I was. I thought there was like one more page and then it was the end of the chapter. Oh, it is. Okay. Okay, I need to finish this and then I have to go and then I'll come back. Okay. No, thank you, Izzy. I appreciate it. Okay. Um, my young bald self ate fire. I'd forgotten how much fun it was, how brave we were, how much we accomplished going on the offensive, remaining dykes. Look at them, I said when Anna came home from the library. Just look. We reunited the statues of Alice and Gertrude. We danced in the snow. 20,000 dykes marched in D.C. There was just such joy in those faces. But that led almost to a new kind of grief and a kind of fury. Our history had disappeared. First Natalie Barney, then the Avengers. Now we were even filtered out of the web, and nobody seemed to notice or care. Because you're fucking women and nobody gives a shit about women. Like, to me, it's like if you can't identify the problem, you're not going to be able to do anything about it. I don't know. The train to Toulouse was late, and the weather was awful, more or less reflecting our mood. Imagine it, trying to work up a smile after all of that and find some way to celebrate dykes in the world blessed by Rick Warren. When the Avengers fighting, where the Avengers fighting so long for lesbian visibility had been made invisible themselves. Lesbians were back where they were 20 years before, more like amphibians than citizens, sitting like frogs in a vast vat of water as the temps slid up to boiling, sedated with their potlucks and sports associations and conferences and websites. Tech advances that shared information at the speed of light but didn't always have ripples in the real world. We couldn't do it. Laugh. In fact, we sucked all the air out of the room when we took our places on the panel of activists, which included Madrid's toxic lesbians, and Harriet and Marie represented Laval, even if it wasn't a dyke thing. Oh, it isn't? Okay, well, as usual in this book, everything is very nebulous and she doesn't really explain shit, so. Okay. With our dueling accents in French, Anna and I went at the audience with sharp sticks, tried to wake them up, and we incited desire, showing video snippets of Avengers taking over Fifth Avenue to protest the murders of Hattie Mae Cohens and Brian Mock, the vast Dyke March in D.C. in '93, and fire eaters at the White House. We even showed Avengers giving schoolchildren balloons that said, "Ask about lesbian lives." But we also pissed them off, declaring how insignificant we were, how hated, actually, when push come to shove. Let's admit it, if lesbian was a dirty word, what were lesbians in the flesh? We announced the dirty secret that it wasn't just bigots to blame. It was dykes hiding in corners and taking it and refusing to claim a place in society. Okay. And this is like thank you, Stefan. Exactly. A bird killed me says she has no right to complain about lesbians disappearing when she calls us queer. Fucking exactly. Um I suppose we could have put a different spin on it, made a joyful call to action. The conference was kind of cool. The organizers were committed to lesbians, but celebrating the power of laughter seemed almost obscene when anger was as taboo as pedophilia. When we abdicated the streets, neither seen nor heard, nor demonstrating, nor running around half naked with bliss, no public platform even for satire, not like Rabelais poking fun at clerics, or Mel Brooks forcing Torquemada and Hitler to sing and dance. Okay, 1 second. Okay, I have to like read these next 2 pages and then I have to go. Okay. Um, the response was mixed. Love for the images of activist dykes, anger at our declaration that lesbians could disappear and nobody would notice we'd gone. One woman said lesbians weren't that invisible in her city. They actually held one whole demo not long ago. Another woman seemed to come out against activism altogether. Shouldn't we stop and think about our goals first? I was accused of being evangelical about street activism. Quote unquote, it's not the only way, she said. I didn't disagree, but my point was that the direct action was a tool. Everybody should know how to use it, especially dykes who rarely have lobbyists or representatives or cultural power. Like the poor of the world, all we have are our loud, annoying voices, our bodies that take up room in the streets. Every time the Avengers pulled off an action, we weren't just making lesbians visible or trying to change society. We were changing lesbians, creating a new kind of dyke who saw public space as hers, who could step out into the street and make noise, be herself, feel at home in the world. In some ways, we were the last utopian group of the millennium, aiming not only for justice but pure freedom. She does talk about this like earlier, where she talks about um like doing activism, like seeing what they had actually accomplished. That it was kind of like a revelatory experience for her. Like it gave her hope and more power and whatever. Okay. It was just the whole point of the first Avengers manifesto. Sorry, it was the whole point of the first Avengers manifesto. We could be as camp as we wanted, as ridiculous, as angry, as serene, and you could get from the lesbian feminists of the 70s to all the equality focused projects without groups like the Avengers, but probably not to a dancing dyke like Ellen or a wisecracking Wanda Sykes. Forget the L word. So she mentioned lesbian feminism. I think this is the second time in the book, but it's like very vague. Okay. By chance, the director, Rose Troche, was at the conference too, and we went to see her presentation the next morning. I had flashbacks to the East Village circa 1994. She'd been a friend of Anne Tedeschi's and had been to a couple of parties in the loft at Avenue B that were full of fashionable queers drinking jewel-colored martinis. She talked about her recent defunct TV show, The L Word, featuring Pam Grier, who Carrie Moyer made an Avenger icon in her film Go Fish, before she was done. Rose managed to inspire finger-pointing, threats, and a near fistfight, at least in the back of the room where there were women. Oh, sorry, in the back of the room where we were. The women were arguing about whether the L word was a sellout or not. Is something better than nothing? Would you really sleep with Shane? Was Go Fish truly an embarrassment with its scruffy butch dykes? Don't those L word bitches even ever work? It was my birthday again. After watching Rose, Anna, and I played hooky and went to a restaurant in the market in Place Victor Hugo, eating the best cassoulet in France and gulping the local wine like we'd been parked for a month. We'd been here first. We'd been there our first year in Paris, in France, on a trip to the southwest that included Carcassonne, where the heretical Cathars had a stronghold before they were targeted by the Inquisition. I got obsessed with them. That whole wide-eyed, desert-dwelling puritanical strain. Thousands were burned at the stake by the equally fanatical church that liked nothing better than freeing people from their disgusting flesh. Maybe the attraction was that I could have been either the heretic or the inquisitor, inflamed by my rage, my hate, my vast consuming love. Okay, there's one more chapter. I need to leave right now. I will come back in a few hours, and read the last chapter and give my comments in the whole book, okay? Okay. Thanks for being here. I will see you later. Okay, bye, sister.